In the sea are these tiny single cells known as diatoms. There are many very different and very beautiful shapes, but they can be seen only with a microscope. The millions of tiny animals and plants that float near the surface of the sea are called plankton. Many of these animals and plants are no bigger than pinheads, but each one is made up of a large number of different cells. Plankton, although it includes some of the smallest of living creatures, is, strangely enough, food for some of the largest animals in the world. Not all whales feed on plankton, but all whales are made up of cells. In fact, all living organisms, whatever their size, are made up of cells. Cells are the building blocks of life. These trees are giant redwoods. Giant redwoods may grow as tall as 80 meters. Despite its enormous size, the cells that make up the giant redwood are too small to see without a microscope. This microscope is over 300 years old. It was made and used by a man called Robert Hooke. He was the first man who ever described cells. They were these cells, cork cells. And this is a copy of a drawing he made at the time. Nowadays, of course, we have much more powerful microscopes, and we know a lot more about cells than Robert Hooke ever imagined. Look at this model. Now, all cells have some things in common. There's this tough, flexible outside wall. And inside are all these important structures. They float around in a liquid that fills the cell. But the most important structure is this, the nucleus. This is the brain of the cell and controls the life of the cell. Many of the plants and animals that you can study for yourselves are just a single cell. This is an amoeba. The cell doesn't have a fixed shape, and it moves by flowing from one place to the next. Inside the cell is the nucleus, which controls everything the animal does. The amoeba captures its food by flowing around it. In this case, a double helping of another single-cell animal called paramecium. Paramecium is a more specialized cell than amoeba. It has a fixed shape, a slipper shape. This is due to the tough outer wall that surrounds the cell. The cell wall is further specialized by being covered with tiny hairs called cilia. The cilia beat in rhythm and move the cell through the water. Paramecium also uses the cilia to get food. Small particles of food are directed to an opening in the middle of the cell where they enter and are digested as they move round inside. When digestion is over, the remains of the food are excreted through the cell wall. This is Hydra. Hydra uses its long tentacles to catch its food. Unlike amoeba and paramecium, Hydra is not a single cell, but is made up of many cells, each cell with a special job to do. If we look very closely at the tentacles, we can see their cellular structure. And closer still, we can see these individual cells, which are particularly important to Hydra. These cells are found only in the tentacles of Hydra. When an animal brushes past, it sets off a trigger mechanism, and a sharp, poisoned barb shoots into the victim. Finally, the tentacles pass the paralyzed food through the Hydra's mouth and into its body. Once inside, the food has to be broken down before it can be used. Lining the body are many different cells. Some produce the juices that break up the food, and others take in the particles and digest them, just like an amoeba. This idea of special cells to do specific jobs is very important in biology, and we'll be investigating it for the rest of the program. But now, let's move from under the water to the surface. These are water lily leaves. If we look very closely at a leaf under a microscope, we can see that it's made up of cells. Moving around in the liquid in each cell are the green chloroplasts. Chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, which gives plants their green color. But plant cells are not only green. There's an enormous variety of colored cells in leaves and flowers. But what is most interesting is the patterns the cells make up. The different colors are not all mixed together. Each cell knows its color and its place in the pattern. You can study the colors and patterns in different plants after the program. And you can also use your microscopes to study individual cells. We used the latest scanning electron microscope to look at some of the specialized cells on the surface of a leaf like this. The first thing to notice is the number of hair cells. And look at the tiny pimples on the surface cells of the leaf. As well as the hairs, there are tiny openings in the leaf. Each hole is called a stoma, a word meaning mouth. There are two cells called guard cells that make up the lips. They can change their shape and so open and close the mouth. But now, let's look at the strangest of all the specialized leaf cells that we found. This is the Venus flytrap. Inside each leaf are three highly specialized hair cells, the trigger cells. For the trap to close, either two separate trigger cells must be moved, or one cell moved twice. The fly touches one trigger and stops behind another. If it moves now, this is the sundew plant. Like the Venus flytrap, the sundew depends upon highly specialized cells. Each cell is covered with a sweet, sticky syrup. Insects, like these ants, are attracted by the sweetness of the cells. But as the ant eats the syrup around one cell, other cells are beginning to do their work. As the ant struggles, so more cells fasten onto its body. It's fighting against one of nature's strongest glues. There is no escape. So certain cells in plants have become adapted to do highly specific jobs, jobs that must be done if the plant is to survive. Now, this is particularly true of the cells in the leaves we've been looking at today. But as you know, leaves don't last forever. When leaves fall in the autumn, they become food for other organisms. The breakdown of leaves is brought about partly by these tiny organisms called bacteria. As they feed, the bacteria grow and divide, as this speeded up film shows. Eventually, the leaf just disappears. But plenty of leaves around for food means millions of bacteria, and they in their turn are food for other organisms. This amoeba-like organism is called a slime mould. You should be able to study the slime mould for yourselves. They're found wherever you get rotting leaves. The slime mould lives on bacteria, and as it eats, so it grows, until it reaches a size when it simply divides into two. So long as there are plenty of bacteria, the slime mould goes on eating, growing, and dividing. But when the going gets tough, and bacteria are in short supply, the slime mould does a very curious thing, as you'll see from this speeded up film. All the tiny amoeba-like cells begin to come together and move towards a central point. At the center, there is formed not a pile of amoeba-like cells, but an entirely new organism, a slug-like animal, which now moves off to a more suitable place. When it arrives, the slug anchors its tail and, rising up, changes into another structure. At the top of the stem, inside the capsule, are the seeds from which new amoeba-like cells will be formed when once more there are plenty of bacteria to feed on. How many cells do you think I'm made of? 50,000? 50 million? 50,000 million? No, 50 million cells. They're all different, and they all have jobs to do. Take skin, for instance. It's waterproof, tough, flexible, self-repairing, and it's made of cells. The cells are flat and continually flake off like dandruff, which is just clumps of dead skin cells. These cells come from inside the cheek. You can easily scrape them off using the blunt handle of a spoon and see them for yourselves under the microscope. In the middle of the cell is the nucleus. Inside our skin, giving us our shape, is a skeleton. Over 200 bones from the skull to the toes. Now, bones are hard and strong, and they too are made of cells. This is a speeded up film of a real bone growing. The special bone cells change some of the calcium and phosphorus in our bodies into the hard material we call bone. Many of our bones act as levers, and when the muscles work, the bones are moved. Let's see how a muscle is made up. Now, on this model here, you can see that the muscle is made up of lots of bundles. These bundles are made up of fibers, and the fibers are the cells. They're long and thin, and in some cases can be more than a centimetre long. Now, the big difference between muscle cells and the other cells in our body is that muscle cells can contract. Under the microscope, we can see a single muscle fibre contracting. When all the fibres in a muscle contract together, the muscle pulls on the bone and produces movement. But a muscle doesn't contract until it gets a message to move. And cells in my brain and spinal cord send those messages. These cells are very specialized, and they're called nerve cells. These are nerve cells from the brain. Radiating from the main body of the cell are numerous processes that join up with other cells to form a very complicated network. One of the most important substances that all the cells in our body need, if they're to do their job properly, is oxygen. Oxygen is carried round in the blood by the red blood cells, or corpuscles. The red corpuscles are the only cells in the body that don't have a nucleus. Their rounded shape makes it easier for them to flow through the blood vessels. These are red corpuscles flowing through the smaller blood vessels. But as well as the red cells, there are other cells in the blood called the white cells. The white cells patrol the body looking for intruders such as these harmful bacteria. They're part of the body's defense system. This is the largest human cell. It's an egg cell, or ovum, found only in the female. To give you some idea of the size of the cell, here's a halfpenny. We've magnified the halfpenny 170 times, the same number of times that we've magnified this model of an egg cell. Now, you can see how small it really is, but it's the largest cell in the body. But a sperm is even smaller. Sperm cells are found only in the male. And it's from these two tiny sex cells that all other cells begin. Once a month, an ovary in the female releases a single egg cell. If it is to grow and develop, it must be fertilized by sperm from the male. These are sperm cells. Millions of them are needed to make sure that fertilization takes place. When they meet, the sperms surround the egg cell, and eventually one sperm fertilizes the egg. 30 hours later, the fertilized egg divides for the first time. 24 hours after this, the two cells divide to form 4 cells. These cells divide again and again to produce the 50 million individual cells that make up someone like me. So there we are. Each cell in our body is incredibly complicated, and just how they all work together to make us tick is not very well understood. But we do know that each one of us began as a single fertilized egg cell.